Don't try to make a joke out of this, John. Don't you dare. What are you here for? Sampson suddenly felt like he was a teenager again, caught in one of Nana's infamous stern glares. There was something so damn familiar about this scene. It reminded him of the time he and Alex got caught stealing records at Grady's while they were in middle school, or the time they were smoking weed behind John Carroll High School and got busted by an assistant principal, and Nana had to come get them released. "I have to talk to Alex," Sampson said. "It's important, Nana. We need to wake him up." "And why is that?" She tapped one extended foot and asked. "3:15 in the morning. Alex doesn't work for the city of Washington anymore. Why can't everybody just leave him be? You of all people, John Sampson, you know better than to come around here now, middle of the night, looking for his help again." Sampson didn't usually argue with Nana Mama, but this time he did. "I'm afraid it can't wait, Nana. And I don't need Alex's help this time. He needs mine." Then Sampson walked right past Nana and into the Cross house, uninvited. Chapter 40. It was almost 4 a.m., and Sampson and I were riding back to the 1st District station house in his car. I was wide awake now and wired. My nervous system felt like it was vibrating. Maria's murderer? After all these years? Was it even a faint possibility that the killer could be caught more than 10 years after my wife was shot down? The whole thing felt unreal to me. Back then I'd been all over the case for a year, and I'd never completely given up the chase. And now we might suddenly find the killer? Was it possible? We arrived at the station house on 4th Street and hurried inside, neither of us talking. A precinct house during the night shift can be a lot like an emergency room. You never know what to expect when you step inside. This time I didn't have a clue, but I couldn't wait to talk to Giametti. It seemed unusually quiet when we walked in the front door, but that all changed in a hurry. It was obvious to both Sampson and me that something was wrong when we got down to the holding cells. Half a dozen detectives in uniforms were standing around. They looked way too alert and anxious for this time of morning. Something was definitely up. Sampson's new partner, Marion Handler, spotted us and hustled over to John. Handler ignored me, and I did my best to pay him no mind either. I'd talked to him a couple of times, and I thought the detective was a showy punk. I wondered why John put up with him the way he did. Maybe he saw something in Handler that I didn't, or maybe Sampson was finally mellowing just a little. "You're not gonna believe this shit. It's off the charts," he said to Sampson. "Somebody got to Giametti. I shit you not, Sampson. He's over there dead in his cell. Somebody got to him in here." I was feeling numb all over as Handler led us back to the last holding cell on the block. I couldn't believe what I'd just heard. First, we had a lead on Maria's killer's whereabouts, and then the man who gave us that lead was murdered? In here? He even had a private room, Handler said to Sampson. "How could they get to him in here, right under our noses?" Sampson and I ignored the question as we stepped inside the last cell on the right. There were 2 evidence techies working around the body, but I could see all I needed to. An ice pick had been driven right up Gio Giametti's nose. It looked like the pick had been used to gouge out his eyes first. "See no evil," said Sampson in his deep, flat voice. "Has to be the mob." Chapter 41. When I got home later that morning, I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep very well. So what was new about that? The kids were off at school, Nana was out, and the house was quiet as a tomb. Nana had put up another of her goofy mistake newspaper headlines on the fridge. "Juvenile court to try shooting victim." Pretty funny, but I wasn't in the mood for smiles, even at the expense of journalists. I played the piano on the sun porch and drank a glass of red wine, but nothing seemed to help. I could see Maria's face and hear her voice inside my head. I wondered, why do we begin to forget, then sometimes remember with such clarity people we've lost? Everything about Maria, about our time together, seemed to have been stirred up inside me again. Finally, around 10:30, I made my way upstairs to my room. There had been too many days and nights like this. I would make my way up to bed and sleep there alone. What was that all about? I lay down on the bed and shut my eyes, but I didn't really expect to sleep. Just rest. I'd been thinking about Maria since I left the station house on 4th Street. Some of the images I saw were of Maria and me when the kids were little. The good and the hard parts, too, not just selective memories of the sentimental stuff. I tensed up in bed thinking about her, and I finally understood something useful about the present, that I wanted my life to make sense again. Simple enough, right? But could it still happen? Could I move on? Well, maybe. There was somebody I cared about enough to make some changes for. Or was I just fooling myself again? I finally drifted off into a restless, dreamless sleep, which was about as good as it got these days. Chapter 42. All I had to do was move on, right? Make some intelligent changes in my life. I'd gotten rid of Maria's old junker and moved onward and upward to our cross vehicle. What could be so hard about making some other changes? And why did I keep failing at it? Alex has a big date, I told myself at various times during the following Friday. That's why I'd picked the New Heights restaurant on Calvert Street over in Woodley Park. New Heights was a big date sort of place. Dr. Kayla Coles was meeting me there after she finished work, early by her standards anyway, at 9. I took a seat at our table, partly because I was afraid they might give it away if Kayla showed up late, which she did, at around 15:15. Her being late didn't matter to me. I was just happy to see her. Kayla is a pretty woman, with a radiant smile, but more important, I like spending time with her. It seems like we always have something to talk about. Just the opposite of a lot of couples I know. "Wow," I said, and winked when I saw her gliding across the dining room. She had on flats, possibly because she's 5'10" without them, or maybe just because she's sane and can't stand the discomfort of heels. "Wow, yourself. You look good too, Alex. And this view. I love this place." I had asked to be seated at a bank of windows overlooking Rock Creek Park, and it was kind of spectacular, I had to admit. The same could be said for Kayla, who was decked out in a white silk jacket with a beige camisole, long black pants, and a pretty gold sash tied around her waist, gently falling off to the side. We ordered a bottle of Pinot Noir and then had a terrific meal, highlighted by a black bean and goat cheese pâté that we shared. Her Arctic char, my au poivre ribeye, and bittersweet chocolate praline crumble for 2. Everything about the New Heights restaurant worked great for us. The cherry trees out front, in bloom in the fall. Some pretty interesting local art up on the walls. Delicious cooking smells. Fennel, roasted garlic, permeating the dining room. Candlelight just about everywhere our eyes went. Mostly, though, my eyes were on Kayla. Usually on her eyes, which were deep brown, beautiful, and intelligent. After dinner, she and I took a walk across the Duke Ellington Bridge toward Adams Morgan and Columbia Road. We stopped at one of my favorite stores in Washington, Crooked Beat Records, and I bought some Alex Chilton and Coltrane for her from Neil Becton, one of the owners and an old friend who once wrote for the Post. Then Kayla and I wound up in Kabani Village, just a few steps from the street. We had mojitos and watched a theater workshop for the next hour. On the walk back to my car, we held hands and continued to talk up a storm. Then Kayla kissed me. On the cheek. I didn't know what to make of that. "Thank you for the night," she said. "It was perfect, Alex. Just like you." "It was nice, wasn't it?" I said, still reeling a little from the sisterly kiss. She smiled. "I've never seen you so relaxed." I think it was the best thing she could have said, and it sort of made up for the kiss on the cheek. Sort of. Then Kayla kissed me on the mouth, and I kissed her back. That was much better. And so was the rest of the night at her apartment in Capitol Hill. For a few hours anyway, It felt like my life was starting to make some sense again. Chapter 43.
The butcher had always felt that Venice, Italy, was kind of overrated, to be honest. But nowadays, with the unending onslaught of tourists, especially the rush of arrogant, hopelessly naive Americans, anyone with a quarter of a brain would have to agree with him. Or maybe not, since most people he knew were complete imbeciles when you came right down to it. He'd learned that by the time he was 15 and out on the streets of Brooklyn, after he'd run away from home for the third or fourth time as an adolescent, a troubled youth, a victim of circumstances, or maybe just a born psychopath. He had arrived outside Venice by car and parked in the Piazzale Roma. Then, as he hurried to catch a water taxi to his destination, he could see the excitement, or maybe even reverence, for Venice on nearly every face he passed. Dumbasses and sheep. Not one of them had ever entertained an original idea or come to a conclusion without the aid of a stupid guidebook. Still, even he had to admit that the cluster of ancient villas slowly sinking into the swamp could be visually arresting in the right light, especially at a distance. Once he was on board the water taxi, though, he thought of nothing but the job ahead. Martin and Marcia Harris. Or so their unsuspecting neighbors and friends in Madison, Wisconsin believed. It didn't matter who the couple really was, though Sullivan knew their identity. More important, they represented $100,000 already deposited in his Swiss account, plus expenses, for just a couple days' work. He was considered one of the most successful assassins in the world, and you got what you paid for, except maybe in L.A. restaurants. He'd been a little surprised when he was hired by John Maggione, Jr., but it was good to be working. The water taxi docked at Rio di San Moise, off the Grand Canal, and Sullivan made his way past narrow shops and museums to sprawling St. Mark's Square. He was in radio contact with a spotter, and he learned that the Harrises were walking around the square, taking in the sights in a leisurely fashion. It was nearly 11 at night, and he wondered what would be next for them. A little clubbing? A late-night dinner at Cipriani? Drinks at Harry's bar? Then he saw the couple, him in a Burberry trench, her in a cashmere wrap and carrying John Barrett's City of Falling Angels. He followed them, hidden in the midst of the festive, noisy crowd. Sullivan had thought it best to dress like an average Joe, khaki dockers, sweatshirt, floppy rain hat. The pants, shirt, and hat could be discarded in a matter of seconds. Underneath, he wore a brown tweed suit, shirt and tie, and he had a beret. Thus, he would become the professor, one of his favored disguises when he traveled in Europe to do a job. The Harrises didn't walk far from St. Mark's, eventually turning on to number 13 Via Martiri. Sullivan already knew they were staying at the Bower Hotel, so they were heading home now. "You're almost making this too easy," he muttered to himself. Then he thought, mistake.
Chapter 44.
He followed Martin and Marcia Harris as they walked arm in arm through a dark, narrow, and very typical Venetian alleyway. They entered a gateway into the Bower Hotel. He wondered why John Maggione, Jr. wanted them dead, but it didn't really matter to him. Moments later, he was sitting across the bar from them on the hotel terrace. A nice little spot, cozy as a love seat. It overlooked the canal and the Chiesa della Salute. The butcher ordered a Bushmills, but didn't drink more than a sip or two. Just enough to take the edge off of things. He had a scalpel in his pants pocket, and he fingered it while he watched the Harrises. Quite the lovebirds, he couldn't help thinking as they shared a long kiss at the bar. Get a room, why don't you? As if he were reading the butcher's mind, Martin Harris paid the check, and then the couple left the crowded, subdued terrace lounge. Sullivan followed.